Welcome back to another Boxscore Geeks show. We are keeping the solo man action going. 2 weeks ago, it was myself. Last week, it was Patrick. He is going to a concert this week because he is just the coolest of all of us. So this week, it'll just be back to me. Tons to discuss this week, so don't worry. And Brian, I know Patrick threw you some fastballs last week, so I'll do the same. In case you're new here, my name is Andres Alvarez, aka Nerd Numbers. And our show is always is produced by Brian Foster. You can find him online at Boxscore Brian. You can find me online as at Nerd Numbers. So anyway, as we always do, Brian, aka the voice of God, jump in and say hey, so people aren't surprised later if I call on you.
Well, I'm never really ready for the fastballs, Dre. I'm more of a bad ball hitter like Vlad Guerrero. So send me all those weird questions. I'll be ready for you.
I have no, this is going to make me feel bad, and I should have just nodded, but I have no idea what that means. So I'm going to have to look that up for the show notes to see what you were talking about. As we know, I'm not a historical baseball guy, but I may be getting there. All right. So show topics, we've got a few. As you may have noticed, if you haven't, if you're listening to this podcast before you've read any of these, we have historical data. Patrick is a freaking all-star. We have historical data on Box Score Geeks all the way back to 1974. By the way, the reason we don't go back further, it's the NBA's fault. That's the furthest back they keep the basic stats that are required for wins produced. I was talking to Arturo a little bit about this. He's mentioned that there are win shares back further. To do that, you basically have to make up stats. So if you look at what win shares does to estimate, Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain, it basically makes up what it thinks their blocks, turnovers, etc. are. So unfortunately, if you're a student of the game of basketball, the furthest back you're going to get comprehensive stats is 1974, unlike those jerks in baseball who can go back, all the way back to Cy Young and etc. So anyway, we have historical numbers of the Box Score Geeks. Definitely check out the player comparison engine. That's under tools at the top. You can now compare players' careers, which is amazing. So make sure you do that. And we're going to be talking that a little bit. We're also, of course, because we're talking historical, we're going to talk some of the 50 greatest seasons of all time and a few that surprised us. We got into a little bit of an argument about Robert Horry, so I'll be talking that. Seems unrelated, so one of these is not like the other. We'll be talking Drake, the ambassador to the Toronto Raptors and how he got them in hot water. Before all that, though, your appetizer will be last week's poll. I'll see if Brian gets that up in front of you. Last week, we asked everybody if they thought, A, would paying college athletes be a detriment to college sports? Would it ruin them? And I'm getting the poll just to get the exact number up in front of me. You guys were in our favor, on our sides. I'm not going to lie, this was one of those polls that I may have biased how I phrased it because I thought it was so ridiculous, but a overwhelming 95-14 did not think that paying athletes would ruin college sports. So there you go. We'll have to see what you guys think about this week's poll, which I'm still mulling over as we go. All right, so historical data. One of the coolest pages, and we'll make sure to link this if you didn't read it in the original post, is we have a 50 greatest seasons of all time. And what I want to get into here, and this is nothing new, we've already talked this a bunch, is just how amazing Dennis Rodman was. If you look behind me, you'll notice I have a Dream Team poster behind me. There are a few players, so this we'll see how good I am in interactivity, Brian. I'm knocking over my mic. There are two players that should make you confused. Up here on the top left, that's Chris Laettner, if you can see this. And then there's Chris Mullin. Chris Mullin has an argument for being on the team. He did have an amazing season. He was a great shooter. He's not the same caliber as these other guys, but in the mid-90s was amazing. Chris Laettner, no business. That should really be Shaquille O'Neal. But one player going into the Dream Team era was Dennis Rodman, who was just an absolute beast, has the best season ever. It's not even close. He's a solid 2.7 wins above Charles Barkley. One of the most...
I do want to interrupt. This is best season since 1977, right? We don't want to throw Wilt and Bill Russell under the bus here.
Yeah, I will. I will actually.
You will? Okay, fair enough. Keep going, Dre.
I don't think... Okay, that is a perfect tangent, though. So Patrick did a good thing in his post and talked about era-to-era comparisons. And here is the truth that we should accept, and I think Arturo's looked at this as well. If we look at the history of the NBA, it's not that the greatest players have gotten worse. In fact, I would argue you go back to the 1960s and grab Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain, or you go back and grab Dr. J. These players would be great in today's NBA. In fact, some of them might be better with increases in medicine training, etc. Read Terry Pluto's Loose Balls, which is a history of the ABA, and it is ridiculous how bad a shape players kept themselves in. They were partying the night before. Of course, there was the cocaine problem in the 80s. Players used to smoke. So I would be amazed to see what some players with better regimens could do in a modern day NBA. But basically, what happened is look at the bench of any player, of any, not any player, of any team in the NBA historically, and most of these players could not make it in today's NBA. So the reality is the competition of the NBA has just gotten better and better. I would argue Dennis Rodman was in the mix of the NBA, this mix of there were few enough teams. The league has expanded since when he was playing, and the strongest competition at his time, that is probably the most remarkable season, both in terms of just overwhelming talent and having the competition to go with it. I mean, the thing about Wilt Chamberlain in his day is, he was just a beast among boys. And, it's gotten harder and harder for athletes. And that does make comparing era to era harder. But I will give a tilt towards more modern eras, which is one of the reasons you'll see me saying LeBron James is one of the greatest of all time. In the strongest competition that has ever been in the NBA, he is on this list 3 times. Kevin Garnett is on it 4. So, heck of a lot of fun. And yeah, Dennis Rodman, not a lot of love, but yes, we cannot compare players in the 50s and 60s. And as I mentioned, to those who might bring up the argument, there are some win shares numbers for that. We don't have the data. If you're going to do any data analysis back then and try and compare individual players, you have to make up stats. That's the best you can do. That's the best you can hope for. Or find someone who has all of the footage and maybe try and go through and do the box score. And if you've seen the quality of footage, I just don't think that's possible. One other name I'm going to throw out, and actually this is all you, Brian, was Rodney McRae, who did manage to earn a title with the Bulls when he was old and beat up. This guy in the middle of the 80s playing for the Houston Rockets was just a beast. And I would argue is one of the few names on this top 50 list, I wouldn't have been able to guess. I mean, there are a few one-offs like Horace Grant, who's right above him. But, almost all the names on this list are greats that I know. And, they're underrated greats like Dennis Rodman and Ben Wallace. But none of these names surprise me, but you hit the nail on the head. Rodney McRae is just this name that I hadn't even realized, and as you pointed out, was just absolutely great. So check over this list if you have interesting names to notice. One of the things I mentioned when I first looked at it is Magic Johnson is on this list 7 times. As our resident Laker fan, Chris Ye, pointed out, check out his book, The Alliance, by the way. It's great. But as he pointed out, Magic Johnson was only healthy for over 2,000 minutes, I think 8 times in his career. So basically, there was like an 80% chance Magic Johnson, if he was healthy, would put up one of the greatest seasons ever. So puts that in perspective, in my opinion. Magic Johnson beats down Michael Jordan as greatest of all time, at least contemporarily wise. Dennis Rodman, one of the greatest ever, underappreciated like mad. LeBron James, greatest ever, greatest modern day player. And oh yeah, Kevin Garnett, if you want a list that is a lesson to why Kevin Love is doing the right thing, he had 4 of his greatest seasons ever wallowing away in Minnesota. Good on you, Kevin Love. Way to get out of there. Oh yeah, we've also mentioned we're thinking of trying to just get a list together of a Boxscore Geeks drinking game. If there anybody out there that's good at infographics and want to put this together, go ahead. One of them is every time we bring up Kevin Love, take a drink. My dogs are being quiet. That was another one. We have a few others on the list. So that's what I got to say about historical data, Brian. Unless you're jonesing to talk more, I'm willing to go on to Robert Horry.
No, I don't have a lot to say. I did bring up Magic Johnson's stats right now, and as we've been saying on this show for a long time, he somehow is an underrated player, which is kind of crazy to think about.
Well, I mean, the fact that he himself will say Kobe's the greatest Laker of all time, this stuff's ridiculous. People, you know, he before Michael Jordan was winning 6 titles, Magic Johnson made it to 9 finals, won 5 titles, was the first player to win 3 finals MVPs. Him and Bird were battling regular season MVP back and forth. The reason Magic Johnson doesn't get the love Michael Jordan does is just the reach of the NBA's television market. Michael Jordan was the superstar right as the markets exploded and the marketing machine exploded. You know, basically you could look at Dr. J as being Michael Jordan before Michael Jordan, and his problem was he was playing in the ABA in front of nobody. So I love you, Michael Jordan. You are one of the greatest all time. You're just not as close to the top of the heap as I think other people put you, and I definitely put Magic above you. All right. So Patrick started this fight. This was about Robert Horry. And I think about a year ago, because that's when Robert was eligible for the Hall of Fame, he basically said he thought he was a Hall of Fame candidate. And Patrick wanted to get us fighting about this. He linked to an article from True Hoop about this very topic. And of course, what ends up happening with Robert Horry, and we're no different, to be honest. When this topic first came up on our internal forum, the first thing Arturo pointed at was basically playoffs and clutch shots and clutch games. And that's what happens when you talk Robert Horry. You say he was a pretty good role player, but when you factor in the rings and the clutch games and, doing what was needed, he's definitely a Hall of Famer. And so that's what got this discussion started. And to bury the lead, our reaction was actually based on the NBA's standards for Hall of Fame players. Robert Horry is a Hall of Famer, but that's just because their standards are too lax. Here's some simple math. The NBA lets in roughly 3 to 5 NBA players every year into the Hall of Fame. There are other people that get into Hall of Fame, things like coaches, ambassadors to the sport, but basically they let in about 3 to 5 players a year. If you were to go back to virtually every draft, there are a few exceptions, but basically each NBA draft produces about 2 stars. So this math shouldn't be too hard. It's to say if you're putting 3 to 5 players a year into the Hall of Fame, but you're only producing 2 stars every year, you're just basically going to have this massive amount of overlay that you're going to have to fill with, not to be mean, subpar players relative to the stars. So the interesting part about the Hall of Fame is it's actually going to be tiered. You're going to have the greatest players of all time, like Magic Jordan, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson. And then you're also going to have the second tier of players that kind of get in, and how they get in, you're just going to have to decide for yourself. And to be fair, that's a good thing. I actually like arguments in sports. I like that the fans aren't always on one side.
Oh, so you're a fan of the BCS in college football? It sounds like then, Dre. That's
Oh,
what everyone says.
Oh gosh, are you
No,
actually?
okay, so I'm trolling you here, but that is the
Yeah.
truth. Is that one of the arguments for the BCS is people say it's good because the fans argue, and that's good for the game.
Well, there are 2 parts. So the way the BCS works for bowl games, if I understand this correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, is basically the bowl hosts can basically decide um, who they want in the game. If they typically go with the top ranked, but if they wanted to, they could go with other teams. And I think that's fantastic. I actually think that arranging playoff games among teams that people want to see play each other is much better than necessarily just following a regimented structure. In fact, in the NBA, Artur and I, and I'm not going to find this for the link of the post. So if a fan of the podcast wants to look through old shows, let me know if you can find this. But we were discussing the playoffs at one point, and basically Arturo said, what if we did some stuff like the lowest seed in the conference, if there is a better record in the other conference, can play, and then teams can decide which bottom ranked seed team they want to play, and all this stuff that would basically arrange for better matchups and more compelling matchups in the playoffs. I am 100% behind this. And I think Dave Barry has mentioned that in his economics classes, when he starts, what he will do at the beginning of every semester is he'll ask who's the best team in college football. And he's in Southern Utah, so I don't know how many college football fans he has out there, but at least a few. And what he ends up saying at the end is, you're wrong. There's not the sample size to know. They don't play enough games. They don't play enough games against each other to make any argument that is compelling statistically. And so with that in mind, I have absolutely no problem with trying to come up with the most compelling matchups as opposed to trying to come up with the most fair. And I actually agree with that in playoffs in general, because, when you look at home court advantage, for instance, and seeding, we already accept that the playoffs aren't fair to every team. Every team does not have the same odds of winning a title. And so what we actually want in our playoffs is compelling television. And so, yeah, it's like, how disappointing was it when the West had, how many games this year go to game seven? And then those teams, the Rockets disappeared in round one. We had the Memphis Grizzlies and the Trailblazers who were, surprising people disappear. The Dallas Mavericks coming out of nowhere. All of these teams were really compelling and they disappear. Then we have to watch who was the fourth seed in the East. I don't even remember. It was that long ago. That's not compelling television. So yeah. Wow, way to throw in a curveball that was completely unrelated to Robert Horry, but is a fun topic. But yeah, when it comes to Robert Horry, he kind of falls into that second tier of player. So bringing back the topic, the Hall of Fame by how it is structured is going to have two tiers of players, and Robert Horry falls in tier two. But then the next subject we brought up in this topic, and by the way, you guys agreed with us. It seems like 68 of you to 19 said Robert Horry doesn't really belong in the Hall of Fame, and this was kind of following Patrick's logic, which is to say the Hall of Fame is for great players, not for just good or very good. Okay, so Robert Horry belongs to the Hall of Fame, but then we looked at, and this was all thanks to Arturo, players that have at least 100 wins that aren't already in the Hall of Fame. So this is by the wins produced metric. And this is kind of more to what I've been talking about when I talk the Hall. I don't like using playoffs or finals for the Hall of Fame because so much of that is reliant on your team. Magic Johnson was absurdly lucky to go to the Lakers and to go to the Lakers in the condition they were in. And by the way, this has become harder and harder in the NBA. Back in the day, teams would trade picks and wouldn't make them lottery protected because they were stupid. They thought to themselves, I'm trading. One of the teams you've brought up, by the way, is the Golden State Warriors. But they would think, I'm trading for the superstar. Of course, my draft pick in 3 years isn't going to be a top three draft pick. And then 3 years later, they were a terrible team. And lo and behold, it would turn out that, the Lakers, and they benefited from this multiple times, would end up with the number one pick. So that's how Magic Johnson, for instance, ended up on the Lakers, who were, I think, a slightly under a 50-win team the year before he joined. Same idea with Larry Bird. He ends up on a team with Robert Parrish and Kevin McHale. Cedric Maxwell, by the way, one of the underrated, not in the Hall of Fame players who shows up on the list we showed. So basically, I'm not a fan of postseason success. I'm a fan of regular season success, regular season greatness. Arturo looked for players that had won at least 100 wins in their career, and there are a bunch in front of Robert Horry. He only finished with about 80 career wins. So even if he does belong in the Hall of Fame, he's got a bit of a wait if we're only letting in 3 to 5 players a year. Dikembe Mutombo and Brent Barry go on the ballot next season. Both of them have over 100 wins in their career. Both should go in first ballot. It shouldn't even be a question. But there are some other names that are kind of just depressing. The one Patrick went off on in the article was Horace Grant, who finished with over 150 career wins in his, I was about to say in his career, nice and redundant, finished with over 150 career wins, helped take 2 separate teams to the NBA Finals, won 3 NBA Finals, was a key part of that first Bulls team. As I've mentioned, Michael Jordan is a great player, but gets way more credit for those Bulls than he deserves, to be honest. So yeah, Horace Grant is painful. The same thing is true with Mo Cheeks, who was also part of some championship squads with the 76ers. And then, as I mentioned, Brent Barry at the bottom of the list. Dave Barry had a great tweet about this where he said, he did all this stuff to help his team win, but probably hurt his own Hall of Fame chances by doing it. And then the most awesome part about this, I'm bearing the lead on shoutouts, is Brent Barry was sending charts to Dave Barry about his true shooting percentage. And he's one of the top 20 all time in true shooting percentage in the NBA. So absolutely. So any thoughts on Robert Horry? Mine is a yes, a trepidatious yes, he belongs in the Hall of Fame, but he darn well better not get there before Dikembe Mutombo, Horace Grant, and a bunch of other names, including Fat Lever is one of my favorites, one of the greatest nuggets of all time, definitely underappreciated.
Well, if you ever go into pornography, that can be your porn name, Dre, Fat Lever. But no,
That's all right. You continue.
I agree with some of the commentators that the NBA Hall of Fame is a little different because they throw in, not just the male NBA players, also female professional players, male and female international players, college players, all the different coaches. So really, it's a huge pool of players they draw from, and it's really tough to say what their criteria should be comparing different roles across different leagues. It's really tough.
Well, yeah, and that's one of the reasons when I was listing it, I was saying about 3 to 5 players a year because it's right. There are all sorts of other things that go in. Phil Jackson went in as a coach, even though he was a player as well. And if you ever think Phil Jackson belongs in the Hall of Fame for his playing career, you're mad. Pat Riley's the same way. Although both of them, oh, this is a fun bit of trivia. Both Pat Riley and Phil Jackson had injuries very early in their career, so it's hard to say what they could have done had they been fully healthy. And it's questionable if being an injured player in the NBA, I have this opinion, if you're injured on the bench and watching your team while you're a player, if that gives you more training to be a coach. Yeah, that's all I got there. And we'll let you, go back if you want to keep voting if you haven't voted on it yet. But yeah, basically, yeah, Robert Horry was good, just not as good as many, many others in front of him. Also, Muggsy Bogues, we've mentioned it before, and Patrick, I think, in his very first post about historical data did too. Has there been a better pound for pound player in the NBA? 100 wins, and he was what, 5'2"?
5'3", I believe, but who knows with NBA measurements. At any rate, anyone. This is one area where I think the eye test will judge properly. He did look significantly smaller than everyone else on the floor, except for maybe Keith Mr. Jennings, who I enjoyed quite a bit as well.
Fair enough. But I mean, just pound for pound, there cannot be a player that has had more wins per inch in the history of the NBA. I've got to imagine. So good job, Muggsy Bogues. So interesting. We've started historical, and so a team that historically does not have a lot going for it, which is kind of a shame actually, is the Toronto Raptors. And we wanted to discuss. This is another, take a shot every time you hear us mention the tech field. So they got in trouble for bringing up, well, Drake. Okay, so here's the full story. And you told me this before the show, Brian. So Drake at a concert that Kevin Durant was attending basically told Kevin Durant he should come play for the Raptors. Because Drake is an official, I'll put that in quotes for those of you listening, not watching, ambassador to the Toronto Raptors, it turns out that they were able to fine the Raptors essentially for tampering because you're not allowed to you're not allowed to start negotiations with players while they're under contract to other teams without permission or something. So yeah, they fined the Raptors 25 grand and then also tried to tell the Raptors, hey, if you drop Drake as an ambassador to your team, we will drop the fine, which they're now trying to deny that they said, but they did apparently say is what we have from the USA Today story. One of the other podcasts I really enjoy listening to about the NBA and other stuff, like this week's show on the Short Corner podcast, Justin Halpern just goes off, I think 5 to 10 minutes talking about how you're not allowed to curse at babies. He's a new father. It's hilarious. So both the NBA and other, you should check out that show and listen to it. They discussed Drake and kind of the NBA a little, and this was one of the interesting things about the NBA compared to professional wrestling or the tech field. I'll get into both. Don't worry. And by the way, if you're talking the Boxscore Geeks drinking game, that's a shot each every time we bring up professional wrestling or the tech field. But in my area of work, which is tech as a software engineer, basically what'll happen is if I go to LinkedIn and say I got a new job, I'll get recruiters that just ping me immediately, which you'd figure is the most silly thing to do. I just said, hey, I just changed jobs, but they'll say, hey, are you looking for work? And in most fields, it's like this. The NBA is this weird field where they want to restrict teams and players talk to each other. We run into people saying that the Heat's big three, they were talking ahead of time, and should the NBA break it up? And one of the things that I've always loved about sports, that not loved from the sense that I like it, but loved because it's just so fascinating, is how in virtually every other area, this kind of behavior would not be perceived as even acceptable, is perceived as rational in pro sports, where you can have fans on the side of how dare players talk to each other 2 years before their contracts are up about playing together, they're cheating. Whereas, if you look at Silicon Valley, big companies poach from big companies all the time. People hop back and forth between Facebook, Google, Apple, etc. This is completely normal behavior. And so now we have essentially a one-up. This would be the same as if my friend, if Brian, if you just went out and said, hey, my friend Andres, he likes basketball and coding, he might be looking for a job, and said that in a public place. and then then I got fined for that. That's essentially what's happening here, and it's absurd. The other part about this for the NBA, which is just really weird to me, is making an entertaining product. I kind of went off on that about the playoffs earlier. But, the NBA should want good players and good markets, people paying attention. And so it's very weird that even the idea of Drake thinking that Kevin Durant should come up north, and I don't think anybody in Toronto believes for a second that's going to happen. Although two short corner podcasts ago, they had a Toronto Raptors fan point out Toronto is the fourth largest North American city. So keep that in mind for anybody calling it a small market. Yeah, this was just absurd, and that's all I got in it. But I did want to bring it up because in professional sports, the NFL too, the no fun league, you have all these rules and restrictions in place about what people can and can't say, what players can and can't do, and that's not normal. And I at least just want to bring attention to it and say, good on you, Drake. Good on you, Toronto Raptors, for not, listening, not going down when they said that. That's about all I got there. And Drake, keep up the work as the ambassador.
I don't have too much to say on this. Yeah, tampering rules are funny. It's I don't know. I don't know what they're trying to achieve here. It seems like more good old boys network type of stuff. It seems it. I suspect there's no way they apply these rules evenly. It seems like teams like Minnesota Timberwolves for Joe Smith, got hit for tampering, and
To be fair, that was legitimate tampering. What's hilarious to me is it was such a stupid tampering part on both Joe Smith
yeah, it
and
didn't accomplish anything for them, right?
and the Wolves. Like both, like basically they caught these people. It's kind of like if you had a D student trying to cheat on a test and he was cheating off an F student in front of him, and they got caught, and you gave them both Fs. Like that was going to happen anyway.
Well, the point is, you have to think there's constant tampering anyway, and you have to think they're not, hitting all of it, and it's probably based on certain owners lobbying more than others. You have stories coming out like Dan Gilbert writing the letter against Chris Paul going to the Lakers, and a bunch of owners, I guess, ganged up and prevented that trade from happening. So I don't know. I feel like all this stuff is political more than anything, maybe.
Oh, absolutely, and it's utterly ridiculous. And that's the point. The NBA is run by a bunch of entitled rich people, and I've seen this even outside of the NBA. Rich people in general, especially entitled ones, do not live in the same world as the rest of us. And it can be very interesting to see how they talk about things. And so the NBA is like, what if you put all of these people in charge of of an economy, so to speak? How would they act? And you get stuff like this, and you're like, wow, yeah, Chris Paul to the Lakers would have been great for the league. The fact that he went to the Clippers, they lucked out that there was another team in that market. Chris Paul going to one of the big markets, for the record, one of the top 50 season, Chris Paul in New Orleans. But yeah, Chris Paul going to a big market is great for the league. And you have all of these owners of the league who have just been arguing that it's losing money. That's why they locked it out, trying to prevent a big star from going to a big market. Imagine if like the shareholders at Apple acted that way. If the biggest store said, "Hey, we want to open in New York City." And they said, "We can't let the best store manager go to New York City because he might do really well." Just I don't know.
Yeah, that sums it up pretty well. When it's convenient for owners, they can argue economics. In other cases, they can argue competitive balance. So just take it whenever it's convenient.
That is the owner mantra. Take it whenever it's convenient. And it's absurd. And yeah, I do think you're right, where it is political. So I just still think it's funny. There are rules in place where people can get in trouble for publicly saying, yes, I would like the MVP of the league to come to my team. Is that really is that something we really need to govern? But
bold statement there, Dre. Bold statement.
I know. All right. So actually with only one of us, and even though we did have a fair bit to talk about, it is the off season. And I don't think, I mean, it always helps when, as the producer, you're not actually really against what I'm saying. Sometimes we argue, Arturo and me, we might have gone down a rabbit hole on Robert Horry. We've actually argued a bit on Robert Horry. So this show could have been an hour and a half if Arturo was here, but with no disagreements, I think we're under half an hour at this point. Might be the case, which is awesome. But it's about time for shout-outs, unless you have anything else, Brian.
I'm ready.
All right. So we got three. The first, as I mentioned already when I was talking to Robert Horry, is Brent Barry. Dave Barry, because we need as many berries into advanced stats, shot him along the article that Patrick wrote and said, "Hey, look, you're over 100 wins." Brent Barry, awesome statement that he was going to have his kids read it every day until they went to college, and then started throwing around true shooting percentage charts with Dave Barry, which is the coolest thing ever. So, Brent Barry, amazing basketball player, amazing dunker, amazing fan of advanced stats, just all around awesome person, made our day with that comment. So thank you. I'm actually going to give kind of a retroactive shout out. This would have come 2 weeks ago, or a week ago had I been on the show. But batty no shoes, especially after we started talking our comment policy. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when I'm done with shout outs. You've been great in the comment section. I really appreciate that. We don't really have official moderators, but I do appreciate having people in the comments that, will make the right argument, shoot down the wrong statements, even though, as I mentioned, we've started deleting some of those. But thank you. You're awesome in the comments. And another awesome commenter who I feel actually we don't give enough love to just because you're all over the place is Andrew Sutton, who, I think has at least 2 to 3 really good insights every week. There are other great commenters. I apologize if I'm not mentioning you. I'll try to get to you for sure. But yeah, you two, just amazing work in the comments section. I appreciate it. I think I stole one of yours, but do you want to make it an official shout out, Brian?
Oh yeah, I'll make it official. Rodney McRae, he's the one guy on that top 50 seasons that honestly, even though I started watching the NBA in the mid 80s during his heyday, I don't remember him at all. So shout out to him for being so underrated.
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, as
I
we
do
met.
have one more as well.
Great.
Jonathan Weiler, again, we keep shouting him out a million times. He has so many good articles on the NCAA, in many places. Look him up. He's great.
We didn't get much into this, and again, if Arturo on the show, this we could be going for 2 hours here at this point. Haven't talked that I do want to bring it up a little is he made a fantastic. This is Jonathan Weiler article on Ferguson, and on more than one occasion we've brought up weird racial undertones that go with professional sports in general, and kind of weird racial undertones that are kind of in the United States just in general. Arturo and I have a more distinct perspective on it because we are minorities. For instance, myself, I'm Hispanic American, and it's really weird when you, for instance, notice that Congress wants to pass a law to make a gigantic fence to your country of origin, and no one thinks this is weird. That kind of thing. So Ferguson I've been pleasantly surprised by how many, not by Ferguson. Ferguson, I'm absolutely against. It's appalling in terms of both rights and liberties to American citizens is just an absolute unjustifiable use of power. But I've been pleasantly surprised by the number of people on my Twitter feed that have been tweeting against it. Basketball fans, it's easy to think of us as, just people who only care about sports. I see that argument a lot. Many of them are political, and I like that. And yeah, I do at least want to, I don't think this is anything shocking, but the Boxscore Geeks does not endorse the Ferguson Police Department or their actions, and hope all the best for the protesters and journalists putting it on the line out there. So sorry to put us on a more dour note, but did want to say that. No Arturo would appreciate it. And then to make it as petty as possible, as petty of a follow-up, because I promised this, the comment section. I did get, you guys have been pretty good, and we've deleted a couple. As I mentioned, if we see anything that says you clearly underrate so-and-so, or the problem with the formula is it underrates such and such, we're just going to delete the comment. And, as I mentioned when I was talking about it in last week's show, it's kind of what we want to see in the comment section. If we notice stuff that we think is monopolizing the comment section, saying the wrong thing, bad attitude, we're just going to delete it. And we wish we had the time to moderate nicer, but I found when I do moderate, try and edit comments, that's just a bigger can of worms. So we're not going to do that. It's kind of like weeding a garden. We love the comment section. We love all your insights. So we're going to pull out any weeds, and it's our blog. I did see someone question why one of their comments was pulled. And what I'll say, if you're listening to this show, it's kind of weird because if you're listening to this show, you're probably not one of the commenters I'm talking to. We're not necessarily going to justify why we pull a comment. We're sorry. But again, part of the reason we're going this route is because we don't have the time or effort to do that. It is our comment section. It is our blog. We enjoy having you here. But, I've had Patrick I don't want to say pull. I know he's not mean about it, but there have been articles I've wanted to write or points I've made that basically have been edited down, and I've done the same thing as an editor. That's how the blog works. We hold ourselves to standards. So as a commentator, you don't get to be you don't get a lower set of standards than the writers do on the show. You don't get to just write whatever you want. We don't even get that. So that's kind of my opinion. That's where we want to go. Sorry to keep bringing it up, but this is something that we're passionate about, and we're trying to keep the comment section good. Appreciate those of you that understand. That's really all I got. This show will obviously be up tomorrow, which is a weird thing to say is upcoming. Note Brian always gives me is make sure to plug anything else coming up. Study I'm working on, hopefully this will go up soon, is looking at minutes season to season and how predictable they are. Spoilers, they're not. And I also, and hopefully I'll get to this soon, promise someone that the wins produced formula does not underrate shooting guards. In fact, if anything, we give shooting guards the best chance they have to look good with advanced stats, and many of them still fail. And going back to a piece long, long ago, I'll see if I can find it. Ari Caroline has made the point before that maybe the shooting guard is a bad position unless you are an amazing shooting guard. So it's possible many, many teams playing shooting guards shouldn't be playing shooting guards at all. They should just throw out two wing players. That's what we got. Hope you enjoyed the show, and we will see you next week.